In the 1850s, artist George Caleb Bingham created 3 paintings that documented key events in the election cycle in his home state of Missouri. Stump Speaking, painted in 1856, shows a candidate pleading for the votes of the men who have gathered at a rural crossroads to hear him and his opponent speak. The County Election, painted in 1854, depicts a raucous election day with men gathered at the county seat to cast their ballots. As some vote, others eat and drink the food and spirits provided by the party workers trying to win their vote. The Verdict of the People, also painted in 1854, shows the aftermath of the election. Some celebrate the victory of their candidate, while others look crushed by defeat. Unlike in the other images, women can be seen watching the crowds, and a black man appears too, charged with the task of cleaning up. Bingham's paintings are popular depictions of the expansion of democracy in 19th century America. They're used regularly in textbooks to illustrate how politics and elections engaged a wide swath of Americans in this era. Elections were an aspect of American life that fascinated European observers. In 1835, French traveler Alexis de Tocqueville commented on what he saw as he traveled across America. As the election draws near, the activity of intrigue and the agitation of the populace increase. The citizens are divided into hostile camps, each of which assumes the name of its favorite candidate. The whole nation glows with feverish excitement. The election is the daily theme of the press, the subject of private conversation, the end of every thought and every action, the sole interest of the present. But was this era really as democratic as it is often remembered? Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 3 things you need to know about American elections and democracy in the 19th century. 1. It is true that the number of men eligible to vote grew after the 1820s. In the years after the American Revolution, some states eliminated their property requirements, but replaced them with requirements that individuals pay taxes in order to vote. In 1800, only 7 states allowed non-property owners to vote, but most of those required that the individual had paid taxes. In North Carolina, propertyless men could vote for members of the lower house of the legislature, the House of Commons, but could not vote for members of the upper house, the Senate. In 1800, only 2 states had no property requirements and no tax requirement in order to vote: Kentucky and Vermont. By 1830, however, nearly every state had dropped its property requirements and its tax requirements. And in the decades that followed, even those holdout states eventually dropped their property and tax requirements. Why they did so can largely be explained by the rise of party politics. In the years after the 1820s, Americans largely divided themselves into 2 major political parties. We sometimes call this era the era of the second party system. In the first part of this era, it was the Democratic Party versus the Whig Party. And in later decades, this evolved into the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. These parties fought hard to win voters to their side. Both parties figured they could gain an advantage if they could expand the number of potential voters. They also heard growing calls from skilled workmen and veterans of the American Revolution and of the War of 1812. These men argued that their service and their skills made them dependable voters. In the colonial era, and even into the early 19th century, most political leaders argued that only men of property really held the virtues necessary to run a republic. By the middle of the 19th century, however, this began to change as propertyless white men argued that they, too, had all of the qualities necessary to uphold Republican traditions. Politicians wishing for their votes listened to them and worked to expand voting rights to them, but they did not extend them to everyone. 2. At the same time that voting rights expanded for propertyless white men, African Americans and women who had enjoyed the right to vote found their right constricted or eliminated entirely. In the early 19th century, the same rules that prohibited propertyless white men from voting sometimes propped open the door for African Americans and women who owned property to vote. New Jersey was most famous in this regard. In 1776, the state's new constitution allowed for men of color who owned property to vote. Only in New Jersey did women have the right to vote. In 1790, a revision of the New Jersey Constitution identified voters as he or she, which opened the door for women who owned property to access the polls. In no other state could women vote. While other states at this time did not admit women to vote, some did allow black men to vote. Among these were Connecticut, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Tennessee, and Vermont. Beginning in the 1790s, however, some states began passing laws to exclude black men from voting. Delaware did so in 1792, Kentucky in 1799. And the number grew rapidly after 1800. Maryland took away their right in 1801. New Jersey passed a law in 1807 that stipulated that voters had to be white men, which took away voting rights for both black men and women. Connecticut took away black men's right to vote in 1818. In 1821, New York barred black men from voting unless they owned property. At the same time, it extended voting rights to propertyless white men. New York barred propertyless black men from voting in 1821, just as it took away its property requirement for white men. Tennessee expressly barred black men from voting in 1834. North Carolina followed the next year. Pennsylvania changed its constitution in 1838 to deny black men the right to vote. In addition to these states, nearly every state admitted to the Union in the early 19th century expressly forbid black men from voting. By the 1830s, black men could vote only in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont. After 1807, women could vote nowhere, and that would remain the case until the late 19th century. So how do we explain the constriction and elimination of voting for some, even as it was expanding for others? Well, it helps to think of these developments as two sides of the same coin. As propertyless white men articulated an image of themselves as good citizens who could be trusted with the vote, they argued that black men and women lacked those qualities. In the case of women, the growing popularity of the idea of separate spheres, the idea that men and women should occupy separate spaces in society, gave rise to the idea that women were ill-fitted for politics and that politics was too rough and tumble for women to be in that space. In the case of African Americans, racial ideologies that depicted black people as biologically or socially inferior were used to argue that they were unfit for citizenship and that they would degrade democracy. The right to vote then, as it expanded to white men, was constricted for those who were not. 3. The expansion of voting rights was not embraced universally, and opponents developed new tools to limit political participation. Political leaders and their parties expanded voting rights to white men in the early 19th century in hopes of winning their votes. However, they feared that expanding the franchise too broadly might allow their opponents to benefit. To prevent this, they developed new tools to limit the electorate. These included laws that excluded the poorest of voters and laws barring those living in institutions like poorhouses and prisons. In fact, every state had laws excluding those convicted of serious crimes from voting. Most states created residency requirements that required individuals to live in a place for a certain length of time before they could vote. These laws were aimed at immigrants in particular, whose numbers were expanding, particularly after the 1840s. So too were new laws that limited voting to citizens only. In the early 19th century, most states had not yet stipulated that only citizens could vote. However, that changed as they passed laws requiring citizenship as a precondition for voting. In some states, however, they would allow those who promised to become citizens to vote. Nativist parties like the Whigs and later the American Party, often known as the Know-Nothings, were particularly supportive of these laws that limited the voting rights of immigrants. They were especially concerned because the Democratic Party had been so successful in recruiting immigrant voters in America's cities. Of course, expanding the right to vote to some and taking it away from others was part of the party politics in this era. Expanding the right to vote is not usually about abstract principles. It's more about math. How many voters can we bring in, and how many voters will our opponents bring in if we expand the electorate? After all, voting is about power. And in the 19th century, political power shifted into new hands. Despite its limitations, the era broadened the promise of democracy in America, and it built a foundation on which others would build later.